Thank you very much, Governor.
Thanks for
I'd
being
like
part.
I'd like to firstly thank the Boston Global Forum and, of course, Tuan for his great organisational ability. So thank you. Um, and it was great to also hear from Ian Duncan Smith and Miriam, as well as co-chairs in the IPAC from other parts of the world. But it's been already, I think, a very successful uh, joining of good forces for good in the world. I'd like to, before I begin in my presentation, I'd like to mention firstly that, of course, in Hong Kong, we've seen 300 people have been arrested in the last few hours, including a 15-year-old girl who was arrested under the new security laws for waving a pro-independence Hong Kong flag. Of course, in liberal democracies, we find such actions anathema. So we have to remember that people, while we're speaking, people are protesting for their very liberties. Ostensibly, of course, this law was drafted to counter terrorism and separatism, but the new laws are so broad in scope and loose in definition that they will no doubt be applied in any manner that Beijing might see fit to pursue its own objectives. These laws are draconian, they silence legitimate dissent, they criminalise activities such as activism and the right of assembly that have been essential components of Hong Kong's autonomy and its unique status. Members of the Australian Hong Kong community have told me that they now fear for their safety and for the safety of their families in Hong Kong. There are over 100,000 Australians who were born in Hong Kong. The Chinese government considers all of them to be Chinese citizens for Chinese legal purposes. And we know this in Australia because we had what was fortunately an aborted extradition treaty process, which I'll expand on later. An activity as simple as communication with a person designated by Beijing as problematic could mean that they will be arrested and charged without judicial oversight if they are to return to Hong Kong. They also note that their family, friends and contacts who are in Hong Kong may be used as a form of hostage diplomacy if authorities cannot reach them. So to give a live example, in Australia this evening, it's 12:30 a.m. here on Thursday morning, but this evening in Australia, in capital cities, there have been people gathering or lighting candles for the people of Hong Kong. And those people, if they have family in Hong Kong and they go back there, then they too may be arrested. We would, in Australia, both political parties would decry this kind of legislation. Trying to understand the motives of the Chinese leadership and the intricacies of its political system may at first seem incredibly dense and complicated, but we must remind ourselves that the CCP's ultimate and overarching aim is, of course, its own survival. The international community should pursue a values-based engagement with China and prosecute our interests as part of this engagement. It is not good enough for Beijing to say that what is happening in Hong Kong is a domestic matter or one of sovereignty, and by extension, not the business of other countries. As part of the handover, China and the United Kingdom signed a treaty under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, a treaty registered under the United Nations. This is a pivotal moment in history. What happens in Hong Kong matters to us all. I'd like to move to discuss the coronavirus and sort of coronavirus. Obviously, as we know, a few months ago, a localized coronavirus outbreak in China morphed into a global pandemic and now threatens the lives of millions worldwide. And in fact, in parts of Victoria, the state for which I'm a senator in the Commonwealth Parliament of Australia, we're actually just about an hour ago, or half an hour ago, parts of Melbourne, with the capital city of Victoria, went back into lockdown. So, we are really battling this virus. Here in Australia, of course, there's going to be a contraction of economies. This is the greatest global health crisis since the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the greatest global economic crisis since the 1930s, worse than the Asian financial crisis, worse than the aftermath of 9/11, worse even than the global financial crisis. Here in Australia, the OECD has projected a negative 5% change in GDP this year due to COVID-19. This could blow out to a 6.3% downturn in the event of a double hit or second wave scenario. To put this in perspective, at the height of the global financial crisis in 2008, Australia's GDP only fell by 0.5%, and it only fell for one quarter. However, what we're watching around the world, indeed to some of the countries where you are watching from today, we consider ourselves lucky. The same OECD data projects the United Kingdom will experience an 11.5% write-down or 14% in the case of a second wave. The pandemic has shut down large swathes of the world economy, particularly tourism, aviation, entertainment and education. While there's been some minor disruption to supply lines, especially from China back in February, trade in physical goods has not yet been directly affected. Coronavirus will inevitably lead to a deep and prolonged global recession, and a deep and prolonged global recession will inevitably impact on every sector. As legislators, the coronavirus pandemic has forced us to ask difficult questions about our economy. None of these questions are harder than how we will navigate the relationship between trade policy and the requirements of a sovereign state to meet a crisis of this kind. And Miriam has just taken us through the objectives of the IPAC, and one of those is obviously fair trade and a fair trading system. Few countries are more dependent on another for trade than Australia is on China. So this discussion has particular relevance for us. China is Australia's largest two-way trading partner. It accounts for over a quarter of total trade and receives more than a third of our exports. We are signatories to a free trade agreement, and they are a major source of foreign direct investment here. Back in April, many of us read with great interest the Sunday Times expose on the UK's pandemic plan. We learned that Britain had allowed its own PPE stockpile to run down as an economic measure because it assumed it could always buy more. And why wouldn't they? This is the basis of comparative advantage, the theoretical underpinning that has fueled the proliferation of global trade. But where does that leave you when the source of the emergency supplies of personal protective equipment needed during a pandemic is the world's leading PPE manufacturing centre in Wuhan, China, also the ground zero of the pandemic? In Australia, we saw a situation where two Chinese-owned property developers with a local presence, Greenland and Risland were the names of the two companies, directed their staff to secure more than 100 tonnes of medical equipment, which was then shipped back to China, resulting in a lack of local supply. While behaviour of this sort is not new, it has moved the dial on how Australians, who wouldn't otherwise be engaged in geopolitical debates, see a more assertive China. And I can assure you, Australians were not impressed. Recent trade data put out by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, showing the change in Chinese export prices from January and February 2020 to March 2020, tells us a global demand spike for Chinese-produced PPE sent prices skyrocketing in March as governments around the world scrambled to secure supplies. Polling by the Australian Foreign Affairs think tank, the Lowy Institute, reveals that a majority of Australians China's regime's willingness to act in the world's best interests. Australia is a country that has always lived by trade. Whether our principal export was gold, wool, wheat, iron ore, coal or natural gas, we have relied on exports of primary products to pay for the imported goods that make possible the relatively affluent lives enjoyed by the majority of Australians. This, combined with a healthy migration program, has been the leading factor in spurring on almost 3 decades of continuous economic growth. But a prolonged slump in world trade will hurt every sector of Australian society. We are just too exposed here. That's why it's been doubly unfortunate for Australia that COVID struck at a time when the world trade system is already under immense pressure. This has mainly been the result of the political and economic tensions between the United States and China and the subsequent intermittent trade wars between the world's two largest economies. Australia, perhaps more than any other country, has been placed in an invidious position by this conflict. But in contemplating how to position Australia as a strong, prosperous, unambiguously independent Western country in the Asian region, we must also recognise our own failings. Our wealth is built on the back of resource exports, but severely lacking in economic complexity and the ability to value add. The Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity ranks us at 87, an export profile sandwiched somewhere between Uganda and Burkina Faso. We are also severely dependent on the whims and, more recently, the temper tantrums of one country. China, under President Xi Jinping, aspires to become a hegemonic power in the Asia-Pacific region. Its recent actions have been an attempt to drive the United States out of the region and reduce the countries of Southeast Asia and the Pacific to the status of Chinese dependencies. At the same time, the United States has indicated that it expects its Pacific allies to invest more in their own security. As a result, Australia is being forced to increase capacity to meet its own defence needs from domestic sources, as well as reduce its dependence on foreign suppliers. There is a broad consensus among Australian policymakers that this needs to be done. The problem, however, is how. In Australia, we have often been slow to take a clear stand on democratic principles when it comes to China. The inconvenient truth is that Australian governments, particularly since 2013, when President Xi first came into his prominent role, have sent China mixed messages. Before eventually coming to their senses and pulling the legislation in 2017, the current Australian government very nearly pushed through an extradition treaty with the Chinese government. It has been a long time coming. It percolated its way through a lengthy process, requested by the Chinese government, facilitated by the diplomats at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and then particularly championed by the then Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop. The implications of this for national security, for individual freedom, and for our reputation would have been devastating. That the then Foreign Minister pushed this proposal so far, in my view, is a terrible stain on her record as Foreign Minister. No longer can China's rise be seen through the prism of a benign international actor only interested in domestic matters. So ubiquitous is the coverage of issues such as political interference, intellectual property theft, non-transparent political donations, and the tacit agreements these come with, as well as academic espionage. It has all but drowned out reporting of the positives of the Australia-China bilateral relationship. And over the last week, we have actually had a series of fingers point towards Beijing. And of course, our parliamentary email system has been the victim of sustained cyber attacks over many years. And of course, people say this isn't really, what a trading partner might do. Australia's actually had hundreds of years of Chinese migration, including large numbers of Chinese immigrants in the Australian gold rushes in the 1850s. It has deep business and trade linkage, those things that come to our mind when we talk about China today. But public sentiment in Australia, democratic Hong Kong, is at breaking point. But we have also seen the release of a report that outlines the extent to which officials in Xinjiang province are forcing women to undergo sterilisation surgeries and have IUD devices fitted in an apparent attempt to curb the birth rate among Muslim minority communities. The co-chairs of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China were privileged to receive a pre-briefing on this report from its author. China's standing among the international community is at its lowest point since its reform era began over 3 decades ago. For Australia, we've had to adapt an Asia-Pacific have had to adapt to an Asia-Pacific region in which China has emerged over this period as a dominant economic power. We've always been proactive in advancing the relationship. Former Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam recognised the People's Republic in 1972, earning enormous goodwill in China. Former Australian Prime Ministers Bob Hawke and Paul Keating further developed the relationship throughout the 1980s and 1990s, taking advantage of China's economic and political opening to the world under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. The growth of trade with China has been of huge overall benefit to Australia. It has opened up a new export market, not just for coal, iron ore and natural gas, but also for agricultural products. It's been a boon for new or expanding industries such as education, tourism, hospitality, financial services, media and the arts. But this mutually beneficial trade relationship was always predicated on the assumption that China would be a rational player in the field of trade, would abide by the rules set down by the World Trade Organization, and would act in the interests of the growth and prosperity of all in an increasingly interconnected region. That assumption held good to a large extent under the reformist rule of Deng Xiaoping and his successors. But China, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, has shown a willingness to use trade, investment, tourism, foreign aid, and Chinese communities outside China as weapons in its strive to establish a regional hegemony in the Asia-Pacific and to challenge the liberal world order. Under Xi's regime, China has sought to use its economic power to bully and intimidate its regional neighbours into compliance, to interfere in the democratic processes of foreign countries, exploit the increasing financial reliance of other nations, use students to promote CCP policy and silence criticism, attempt to recruit agents of influence in democracies worldwide, and intimidate its diaspora. In Australia, it has enrolled business leaders with large investment stakes in China to act as surrogates for Chinese policies, a tactic we see mirrored by apologists in politics, media, and academia around the world. To top all of this off, we now have a conflict between China and the democratic world over responsibility for the global disaster that is the coronavirus pandemic. It's no surprise that the facts about this are disputed by the Chinese government. As is always the case with authoritarian regimes, the first thing they do is attempt to cover up the problem. Few could doubt China has greatly embarrassed itself through its reaction to the pandemic and the reputational consequences it has undoubtedly faced around the world. Australia has led the international community in its demands for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus outbreak. This is a reasonable request, not least because it will help us put in place policies to ensure that this doesn't happen again, and in turn that will make the world a safer place. But China has predictably lashed out at Australia for taking this position. In the past few months, we have had selective tariffs imposed on Australian exports. And it doesn't take a cynic to reach the conclusion that this is punishment for our temerity. Governor Dukakis, you mentioned in the previous session how important continuing dialogue is with Chinese officials. The Trade Minister has made repeated attempts to contact his counterpart in China, and those phone calls have not been answered. Those emails haven't been answered. In fact, there has been no response. So we think that, they've been acting like a jilted lover, in a breakup, threats, rants, retaliations, the works. So similarly, we've had suggestions from Beijing that Chinese students should not return to Australia when that becomes possible. In these circumstances, it has become increasingly difficult to maintain a normal relationship with China. And ultimately, it has drawn many to the conclusion that while we hoped and expected that the world would change China, it is in fact China that is trying to change the world. This should encourage us to reflect on the vulnerabilities that the coronavirus outbreak has revealed. China is a sovereign nation. It has every right to reject calls for such an inquiry. However, China is also a country with global ambitions, and with these come a responsibility to engage with the international rules-based system and agreed upon norms as a good global actor. I won't talk for other countries, but for Australia, disengagement is not an option, and nor should it be. However, it is true that our relationship with China is entering a new phase, a widely accepted view across the political spectrum here. Constructive engagement is a term that is also a much abused term, and we should be very wary of applying it to undemocratic and oppressive regimes. Nevertheless, democracies are right to engage in constructive engagement with China, provided that basic principles are not violated. But we need to be more hard-headed about this process than we have been in the past. Our values should be known and placed front and centre when dealing with Chinese government officials. And while many would urge we just shut up and take the money, this is non-negotiable, and we must never capitulate to intimidation and threats. After all, the art of war is to subdue the enemy without fire. I already mentioned negative perceptions of China's intentions as polled by Australia's Law Institute. This same poll, which was released maybe 10 days ago, also found that 94% also think that Australia should reduce our economic dependence on China. That's 94% surveyed. We can and should seek to do this by broadening and deepening our economic relationships with other established and emerging powers. In our region, this would include India, Indonesia, as well as the member states of ASEAN, and we should do this as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kimberley.